Hello and welcome to History Bite, and today we're discussing Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, someone who rose from relatively humble backgrounds to shape the history and the future of France, becoming one of its greatest heroes. Joan of Arc was born around 1412 in the town of Domremy in France. Her parents were peasants, and so she was raised learning to sew and work on the farm. Joan's childhood would have had strong religious connections. France was a very deeply Catholic country, and religion was important to everyday parts of people's lives. In the decades leading up to Joan's birth, England and France had been embroiled in the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had begun with the English King Edward III's invasion of the French mainland in 1337. By the time Joan was 1 year old, the English king, Henry V, had won his famous victory at Agincourt, and large areas of France were now under English control. When Joan was around 12 years old, something miraculous happened to her. She was visited in a vision by Michael the Archangel. In this vision, he told her that God had chosen her and that she was to lead the French in a battle against the English. Michael told her that after she drove the English out, she was then to take the king to be crowned at Rheims. This was important because at the time, France should have been ruled by Charles, who would have been Charles VII. However, he'd never been crowned, mainly because of internal disputes within the country, and also because the English had taken control of Paris, the capital city. Over the next few years, Joan continued to have visions and hear voices, which she described as beautiful and wonderful visions delivered from God. When Joan turned 16, she decided it was time to listen to her visions and finally take action. But Joan was just a peasant farm girl. How was she going to gather an army to defeat the English? The best way, she decided, was to speak to Charles himself and ask for an army. She first went to the local town and asked the commander of the garrison, Count Baudricourt, to take her to see the king. And this perseverance, and the religious sympathies of the local commanders, earned her an audience with Charles at the royal court in the city of Chinon. Charles VII was sceptical about Joan, and so he proposed a test to make sure that she really was sent by God to help him. He disguised himself as an ordinary person and hid amongst a crowd of people in his court. When Joan arrived, she instantly picked him out of the crowd. Joan had passed the test. She'd identified Charles, and so Charles was convinced of her divine purpose. After having endured constant humiliating defeat, one after the other, the French people and leadership of the country were demoralized. Every other rational option had been attempted and failed. So did Charles have anything to lose? So in 1429 he let Joan accompany a convoy of soldiers and supplies to the city of Orleans, that was at the time under siege from the English army. The English had surrounded the city for 6 months, and the city was close to breaking. Joan was given armour for protection, and during this time she became a confident wielder of a sword and an expert horse rider. She was elated when she found out that the king would allow her to fight herself. Meanwhile, the news of Joan's visions had reached Orleans before she did, and the French people trapped inside started to hope and pray that Joan would come to save them from the English. When the French army arrived at Orleans, with the English already surrounding it, the French people greeted her with cheering and celebrations. It was in April of 1429 that she launched her attack against the English. Some historians claim that she didn't lead the battle herself, but carried a banner to inspire the men. However, there are many who argue that Joan had a role in decision-making, since the commanders of the army believed her advice was divinely inspired. During the Battle of Orleans, the English put up a strong fight, and Joan was actually hit in the shoulder by an arrow, but continued fighting despite that. Eventually, though, the combined efforts of the French in and outside the city were able to defeat and repel the English in May 1429, giving Joan the great victory over the English she'd been promised in her vision. However, she still needed to lead Charles to the city of Rheims to be crowned king. Joan and her army cleared the way to Rheims, taking bridges and small fortifications from the English and gaining followers as she went. At the Battle of Patay, the English suffered a defeat almost as bad as they had inflicted on the French at Agincourt. Soon they'd made it to Rheims, and Charles was crowned King of France at Rheims Cathedral on the 14th of June 1429. This fairy tale was not to last forever. In May 1430, less than a year later, Joan heard that the city of Compiègne was under attack by the Burgundians, a group from Burgundy who had allied themselves with the English. She took a small force to help defend the city, but got surrounded by Burgundian troops. Eventually she was pulled off her horse and captured, ending up imprisoned at Bourrevaux Castle. But Joan showed her resilience once again. She tried to escape many times, even jumping from a 70-foot tower onto soft ground, but the Burgundians were onto her plans and moved her to the town of Arras, where she was eventually sold to the English for 10,000 livres, around £200,000 today. Despite threats from Charles VII, the English refused to hand her back to the French. The English held Joan at Rouen, the headquarters of the army in France, and they gave her a trial to prove that she was a heretic. This way they could justify killing her. They questioned her over and over the course of several days, trying to find something that she'd done that deserved death. In the end, her clever wit and religious zeal meant that they couldn't find anything wrong. However, during the battles she'd fought, she'd worn armour like a man and her hair short. For the English, this was enough. They called her a cross-dresser and said that she deserved death because she was a heretic. Joan was tied to a tall pillar in Rouen and burned alive at the stake on the 31st of May, 1431. She asked for a cross before she died and was given one by an English soldier. After she was burned, the English were so afraid of rumours that she had escaped that they displayed her charred body to the crowd and then burned the body twice more. They then threw her remains into the Seine River. She was only 19 years old when she died. Joan of Arc became a legend in the years following her death. For a woman to lead an army in medieval times was quite unique, not unheard of, but still not a regular feat, and to rise so high at such a young age from a peasant background was remarkable indeed. Her religious piety and bravery in battle inspired the people of France to rise against their English invaders in battles which became turning points for the French in the 100 Years' War. 20 years after her death, an investigation was authorised by Pope Calixtus III. He examined the trial and refuted the charges, pronouncing her as innocent. Although this was a little bit late because she was already dead, he was able to make her a martyr. And to add to that, in 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte declared her a national symbol of France. She was then canonised, which means made into a saint, in 1920. Today, Joan of Arc has been immortalised through various pieces of literature, through paintings, through sculpture, and also through the medium of film. Despite some revisionist historians claiming that Joan of Arc was just a myth, her legacy still continues to this very day. If you enjoyed this video and would like to find out more about history, why not subscribe to our channel or follow us on Twitter or Facebook?